Alright, I'm going to begin. Let me turn off the music here. I got to hit one more button, and there, I'm ready to go. This is January the 24th. Random Thoughts from County Antrim. I'm your host, David McDonnell. And I decided today to tell you a legend, an old Irish legend from the mythological cycle. And it's a long one, so I'm not going to start this podcast off with my usual ramblings and my random thoughts. I'm going to go directly to the legend, which is entitled The Children of Lir. Now, there was a battle fought so long ago that no one can tell you that much about it, save its name or its location. And about that, there might be some doubt, so I will not bother telling you about that. But one side of the battle were the Gaels, who roamed the continent of Europe for centuries before they arrived in Ireland. The other side were the Tuatha De Danann. It was the mythical people who long ruled Ireland. And the battle was won by the Gaels, who thereafter ruled all of Ireland. But the Tuatha De Danann still were held in high esteem for their knowledge and their wisdom, particularly in their command of the mysteries of life. And as time went on, the Gaels became more and more the people of the world, and the Tuatha just receded kind of into the world of the mystery and imagination. And they were, after all, people of the gods. That's what Tuatha De Danann means. And each side kind of conceded the expertise to the other, where one side ruled the worldly issues of the island, and the other side were sort of the commanders of the mystery, the spiritual side of the island. Now, after their defeat, the Tuatha De Danann leaders from the provinces decided they should have one king amongst them, so they would remain unified and undivided. And the chiefs of the various tribal groups of the Tuatha De Danann met, and they decided quite quickly that there were 5 of them who were probably more capable than any other to be the king, the unifying king. And of those 5, it didn't take too long to realize that the best of the group was Bov Jarag. And I won't tell you the story of 3 out of those 5 because they're just not involved in this particular story. But there was a 5th who dissented, and his name was Lir. And Lir just took the election of Bov as a personal insult. He was a vain man, and he was certain that no one but himself should have been considered, let alone elected. And when he found out otherwise, when the vote turned out otherwise, he was filled with envy and anger, and he stormed out of the assembly, speaking to no one, didn't show homage to Bov as the newly elected king, and went back to his home in Monaghan. Now, the chiefs who witnessed this were incensed. They agreed amongst themselves that they must assemble an army and march to Lir's fortress in Monaghan, tear down his fortress and kill Lir. But Bov said otherwise. Bov said that Lir is a powerful man, and he's an embittered one as well. He said if we attempt to take over his fortress, he will defend his territory, and many, many people will be killed. And whatever the result, it will not make me any more your king than I am now. Now, the remaining chiefs were impressed with Bov's wisdom and justice, and it made them feel better about their decision about selecting Bov in the first place. And so Bov continued to rule for many, many years from his castle in Connaught. And Lir, on the other hand, was ostracized. He lived with his people in Monaghan, but it was a lonely decision because no one wanted to associate with him other than the people he already knew in Monaghan. Now, sometime later, misfortune struck Lir. His beautiful wife died from a mysterious illness that she only encountered a few days before that. And while Lir was despised through much of Ireland, his wife was beloved and respected by everyone, and the entire island mourned her death. And Bove was particularly moved by this, and had compassion actually for poor Lir. And he made a comment to some of his chiefs. He said, "It's time like this that a man is most in need of friendship. And Lir has been much too long a stranger. And now that his wife has died, I must offer friendship to him, if he would accept it." And so he said, he continued to say to his advisors, he said, "Yeah, as you all know, I'm the foster father of 3 daughters of Ailill, of the Aran Islands. And they are amongst the most accomplished and beautiful women in Ireland. He said, I will offer one of them to Lir to be his wife. And Lir would be foolish to reject such an offer of friendship." So the chiefs again were impressed with Bove and his wisdom. And a message was sent to Lir. And Lir was pleased with the message. And he had become even lonelier after the death of his wife. And considerable time had passed, so he was less embittered by being overlooked in the election of a king. So he assembled an entourage from Monaghan to travel to Connaught. And he was greeted with much fanfare. He was introduced to the daughters, the foster daughters of Bove. And he was invited to choose one to become his wife. And they were, indeed, the 3 young ladies were as represented. They were witty, they were beautiful, they were intelligent. Now, the eldest was named Neve, and the middle daughter was named Aoife. And the youngest daughter matters not at all because she's not a feature of the story, but Lir just found it impossible to choose between them. And he said, "It just besides me because I cannot determine who is the best. But if I must choose, I'll choose the eldest. I'll choose Neve as a fitting wife for a chief." And everyone was impressed with Lir's wisdom. They were married. There was a huge celebration in Connaught, followed by a huge celebration in Monaghan. And in time, Lir and Neve had children. They had twins, actually, a girl named Finola and a boy named Eid. And within a few years, Neve gave birth to another set of twins. This time both boys, a boy named Fiacra and a boy named Con. But the second birth was filled with sadness as well as happiness for the birth. And the sadness was because Neve did not survive childbirth. So for a second time in his life, Lir had lost a wife. Now when the news reached Bove, he had almost as much grief as Lir because everyone loved Neve. And he decided, I have to go another step to make Lir a happy man and to keep the peace within the island. And he said, I will offer the second foster daughter, Aoife, to Lir as wife. Messengers were sent again to Lir, and after an appropriate period of mourning, Lir traveled to Connaught, and he married Aoife. The two traveled to Monaghan to begin their life together, and indeed they were very, very happily married for many years. although Aoife did not have the blessing of children of her own. But Aoife loved her husband, and she loved the children of her sister. They were now both, they were her niece and nephews, but they were also her stepchildren, and she loved them very, very much. And Bove loved them, the children, as well. He gave them the love of a grandfather. Visited the children often, and Monahan often brought the children to visit him in Connaught. But no one loved the children as much as Lir. He played with them for hours before he began the work of the day. And when he finished the work of the day, he played with them yet again. And he took no more delight in anything than he did when he was with his 4 children. Now, over time, Aoife's love for the children eventually turned to jealousy and even hatred. And one would have to look deep in her heart to know what had happened. Perhaps it was the absence of her own children. Perhaps it was Lir's devotion to the children. But simply, I think that envy just has its own perverted logic. And Aoife's jealousy eventually made her ill, physically and mentally. She actually spent a year in bed with this illness. And that illness, of course, worried Lir. For he loved her, and he had already lost 2 wives. But his attention for her really did not help. It just fed on her jealousy. So much so that she eventually reached a decision. And the decision she reached was that the children must go. And so ends part 1 of the story of the Children of Lir. Now, after a considerable time in bed, Aoife said she had recovered. And to celebrate, she decided to visit Bove and take the children with her. And the boys were delighted, both with her recovery and with another opportunity to visit Bove. Finola, though, was not. She had a dream, you see, just the night before. And in her dream, Aoife perpetrated a deed, an evil deed, upon Finola and the boys. And although it was only a dream, Finola did not want to leave Monahan. She was, though, ashamed, I think, to share her dream with anyone else. So she ended up going, the 4 children and Aoife, from Monahan to Connaught. Now, within a few days, the 4 children with Aoife and Aoife's most trusted guard left for Connaught. And the guard's name was Conan by name. And he served for Aoife's father and Aaron, the Aran Islands, for many, many years. And he continued to serve Aoife while she was fostered to Bove, and also when she was married to Lir. And on the journey, Aoife asked Conan, he says, is there anything in the world that you would not do for me? And he said, no, I've watched for you your entire life. I would never let harm come to you, and I would do whatever it is you asked of me. So she said, I must ask you to do a deed. I'm losing the love of my husband, and it is because of these children. They have ruined my life. I ask that you remove them from my sight and that you kill all 4 of them. Conan looked at horror at this, but it only increased Aoife's anger, so much so that she took the sword from Conan and said, I'll do the deed myself. But Conan stopped her. So she had to come up with an alternative plan. Now the group continued their trip west, and they reached a lake in Westmeath, and a good place to camp and spend the night. With a smile on her face, she said to the children to go to the lake and take a bath. And the children were gleeful about that, and they removed all their clothing. And as they ran, as naked as the day they were born, into the lake, one by one, Aoife took a druid wand and tapped each one of them as they went by. And as she did so, each one of the children turned into a beautiful snow-white swan. Now the four frightened and bewildered children just kind of fluttered away, each trying desperately to shed themselves of the feathers. But eventually they quieted down, and an immense sadness descended on each one of them. And it was... I have dogs that have interrupted my story. And there were not dogs in the story, they were swans. Now, Finola, just like her brothers, still possessed the power of speech. And she turned to her aunt and her stepmother. She said, Aoife, why did you do these terrible things to us? We've always loved you and thought that you loved us. Aoife did not respond. So Finola continued. She said, please tell us at least this. How long shall we remain in the shape of swans? At least tell us when this misery will end. Aoife said, well, you have been wiser not to ask. But since you did, I will tell you the answer. You will spend 300 years on this lake. 300 more years you will spend on the Sea of Moyle, which separates Scotland and Ireland. And then you will spend 300 more years off Innisglora in Mayo. And even after that, you will remain swans until the great prince from the north marries the great princess from the south. And until another great man brings a new god to Ireland. Neither your powers nor mine, nor that of anyone else, can free you until such time as all of that occurs. I will, though, she said, allow you to keep your power of speech and your power of human intelligence. And your voices shall continue to be so sweet that you will sing music sweeter than any music heard anywhere in the world. And with that, and with the shocked Conan at her side, Aoife turned away and left the four swans in the lake. Now, Aoife received a great welcome when she reached the castle of Bove, and Bove, of course, was wondering, where are the children? When he saw that they were not with her, and Aoife had no choice but to make up a lie. She said it was Lir who would not allow the children on the trip, even claiming to Bove that Lir thought that Bove may harm the children. Bove was astonished at this, and he sent a messenger for Lir, and the messenger said Lir arrived at Connaught alone. She told the king that she would not allow the children to come with her. Now, Lir could not understand this at all. Why would Aoife say such a thing to the king? But he did know the children left Monaghan with her, and that he must now try to find them. So he gathered his men, and he left Monaghan on the direction of Connaught, looking for the children every inch of the way. And eventually got to a lake in Westmeath, and he thought it would be a good place to let the horses rest and drink. And while he was at the lake, he and his men heard four swans singing the most beautiful song any of them had ever heard. And of course he was astonished by this and had to get a closer look at these swans who could sing in such a beautiful in harmony and human voices. And when he got close to the swans, one of them, it was Finola, said, "Dear father, it is I, Finola, and these are your other children. We were changed into swans, with our lives ruined, all by the hatred and the witchcraft of Aoife." Lir gave a shout of grief, and he looked for a moment as if he would lose his mind. But when he recovered, he said, "How can I restore you to proper form?" To which Finola replied, "You cannot." "Well, how do I get you? Can I take you with me to Monaghan?" And Finola says, "No, we cannot. We must stay in this form and stay on this lake for 300 years. So Lir and his men stayed at the lake for that evening, but the next day they had to leave for Connaught to tell Bove about the travails and the condition of the children. So they went to Connaught, and when they arrived, they told Bove the whole story, which of course Bove couldn't believe, but he turned to Aoife, looking for a denial. But no denial came. And as Bove looked into her eyes, he realized that Lir had spoken the truth. Now, what Bove did to Aoife is something I cannot say, but you can use your imagination as to how significant and serious it was. Bove then assembled his men, all heading for the lake, and indeed, as word spread, most of Ireland headed for this lake, because they had all heard by then of the treachery of Aoife and the calamity imposed on the children of Lir. And once they arrived, they all heard the pleasant music, as pleasant as anything ever heard anywhere. Nothing before and nothing since has ever compared to the sweet music that came from those swans in that lake in Westmeath. Now, for 300 years, there was nothing they could do, but for 300 years, the people of Ireland traveled to this lake whenever they were ill or in distress, because anybody who listened to this music could forget their trouble and forget their pain. They could sleep a gentle sleep, which they could then awake and be refreshed. Such was the peace that came from listening to the children of Lir in this lake. Now, at the end of the 300 years, it was time for the swans to leave. And from the calm, peaceful lake, they had to go to the dark waves of the Sea of Moyle. And on the morning of the 300th day, the four swans just kind of skimmed over the lake, flapped their wings, and got their long necks outstretched higher and higher until they climbed high enough to make that flight. And they looked down on the lake and they saw camps of people. And all the way on their journey from the lake to the Sea of Moyle, they saw groups of people gathered, looking up, because everyone wanted to see one last look, one last glimpse of the children of Lir. Now, the people of Ireland were so saddened and upset by their departure of the children of Lir that they made a new law. And from that day on, and actually continuing to this day, it is against the law in Ireland to kill a swan. Because after all, it may not be a swan. It may be one of the children of Lir. And so ends part 2 of the story. Now, the law forbidding killing of a swan may have saved some Irish swans. It did nothing for the children of Lir. They remained condemned with their curse, and they now face, for centuries, the Sea of Moyle. They found themselves adrift on the Sea of Moyle, and it's a wild sea. It's a cold, steep, rocky cliffs. The Atlantic's, the storms coming in could create extremely cold water and heavy waves. It was never calm. Wave after wave, forced by bitter winds, came down from the north. And so they lived there for many, many centuries. And they suffered, and they endured. But they were bound together, the four of them, by their shared hardship. But they were prevented by the curse from leaving the Sea of Moyle. They stayed there, and they endured. Now, from time to time, they would encounter travelers who were traveling along the coast of the Sea of Moyle. And these travelers would spot the swans, and they heard their wonderful music. And although saddened by their plight, these travelers were always delighted to see the children and know that the Children of Lir were still alive. And news of these sightings would always travel throughout Ireland. Now, they continued this ordeal on the Sea of Moyle for many, many more years until at last they fulfilled their 300-year term on the Sea of Moyle. And now it was time to head west. And west they did. They lifted themselves up in the cold waves of the Sea of Moyle. They flew west over Ireland. They flew high, not even wanting to look below them for fear it would break their hearts. And eventually they came to the Atlantic, near Ennisclora. And the sea there was not as cold as it was at Moyle, but the storms from the Atlantic were far, far greater. And with the hardship was not the same, it was of equal intensity. And they found themselves in the hardships renewed to such an extent that it really would repeat the story that I gave you about their hardships on the Sea of Moyle. And so they remained on the Atlantic for 300 years. And that ends part 3 of the story. One more to go. Now, 300 years passed on the Western Sea, as had 300 on the lake and 300 on the Sea of Moyle. It was now time, finally, for the Children of Lir to leave the waters. So the four took flight from the western shore, and they flew to Monaghan, in the home of Lir. But nothing but sadness and desolation was before them. The great castle of Lir, which once dominated the landscape and the surrounding plain, was now broken and tumbled. The windows were gone. The mortar between the stones had faded, and the stones had fallen. The village which once surrounded the castle were now empty, overgrown. Nothing was there. So the four swans spent the night in this empty castle. They stirred from time to time, but they made their sad, sweet music from time to time. But it was a sad, sad night after they had returned to Monaghan. And they left in the morning, and they headed back for Ennisclora. They had lived in the sea around Ennisclora for 300 years, but they never were allowed before to go on shore. This time they did. And they lived on that island for many, many years after the 900 years had elapsed. And they lived there not knowing, for example, that St. Patrick had come to the island, or who St. Patrick was, or why he was there. But one night on the island they heard a sound, and it was a sound of singing by a man. And they didn't know who could make such a sound or what the sound was about, but Finola had an intuition, and she said this must be an omen. Perhaps it means the end of our curse. So the four swans sang out in their own voices, as loud as they could and as beautifully as they could, because they all sensed perhaps there was an end to their curse. And a priest on Ennisclora, a disciple of St. Patrick, he'd heard the sweet music, And indeed, the prior sounds were coming from him. And he walked in the direction of the sounds. And when he reached the source of the music, he saw nothing but 4 swans. But he realized immediately that they were the children of Lir. And the priest spoke to the swans, and the swans spoke back to him. And the children were delighted, and they joined the priest in the monastery, and they spent many, many years together, the 5 of them, exchanging their knowledge. And the 4 swans told the priest stories of Ireland going back 1,000 years before. And the priest in turn told them stories about what was going on in Ireland then, at least all that he knew. And in particular, he taught them about St. Patrick and the new faith that was now accepted by most of Ireland by that point in time. Now, the King of Ireland at the time was from Connaught, and his wife was from Munster. And they were, as you might expect, if you were paying attention earlier in the story, the wedded prince of the north to the princess of the south, as mentioned in Aoife's spell on the Children of Lir. Now, the queen was a vain woman, like many in her station. She was gracious and kindly towards others, so long as she was satisfied that she possessed everything of importance herself. And when she heard about the swans and the singing and the talking swans of Innisglora, she said to her husband, "I want to own those swans, and you must go get them for me." The king was reluctant to do that, but he had never refused his wife before. So he set out to get the 4 swans of Innisglora. And when he arrived, he made his demands, but the priest refused to give up the children. He says, "I have no power to give them to you any more than you have the power to take them." Well, the king says, "I'll show you what power I have." And with that, the king grabbed one of the swans. And it was then that a strange thing happened. Suddenly, the white feathers covering the 4 swans faded away. And the shapes of the 4 swans began to change in front of everyone who was present. Slowly, the 4 swans, the Children of Lir, resumed human shape, but with a difference. Instead of 4 happy, delightful children who were the love of Ireland 1,000 years before, they had the look of humans who were indeed 1,000 years old. Each of them was bent. They were old and wrinkled. Their eyes were sunken in their heads. And the 4 Children of Lir were so feeble they could hardly stand. Now, the 4 Children of Lir must have realized that they were about to die. And Finola said to the priest, "All I ask is that you bury us together, with our arms around each other, each one of us facing each other, so that we are together looking at each other like we have been for this past 1,000 years." And then they sang one final song. It wasn't the sweet music that they had been singing for so long. Rather, they sang it with old, cracked voices. And then they soon thereafter they did die, and the priest honored their wish, buried each of them the old Celtic way, standing up, each facing each other, with their arms draped around each other. And so ends the story of the Children of Lir. Now, the Children of Lir is kind of often thought of as a children's story. Indeed, there's many, many versions of it written as children's books, and it's been told to children in Ireland for many, many years. But the story is far more than that. It's a poignant tale, and it has a lot of literary merit. I actually deleted much of the story, particularly the parts dealing with the harrowing experiences in the Sea of Moyle and in the Atlantic, and with their many, many encounters with different people throughout the millennium in which they were swans. Those stories are quite involved and wonderful, and belong in a written version of the Children of Lir. It was difficult, though, to include them in an oral telling in a half-hour podcast, so I kind of cut it out. But it, again, just to show that it's quite the literary value of the story of the Children of Lir. As parts of the story you might recognize, it's thought to be the inspiration of William Shakespeare's King Lear, and of Tchaikovsky's Swan Lake ballet. I tried to get verification from Shakespeare and Tchaikovsky, but they didn't return my calls. But it's one of the many stories in the mythological cycle of Ireland, tales of godlike people who first settled Ireland. And as one might expect, there are many, many versions of these stories, particularly this one. But what you heard was my version, taken from many others, but told in a way that just makes it the most fascinating, at least to me. And I hope you enjoyed it. And with that, I must say, goodbye.